The year 1945 marked the culmination of World War II in Europe, a year of relentless conflict and extraordinary events that led to the collapse of Nazi Germany. By this time, the Allied forces had closed in on the Third Reich from both the east and the west, while the German war machine, which had once seemed invincible, struggled to sustain itself under mounting pressure. The final months of Nazi Germany were defined by intense battles, strategic missteps, and the crumbling of Adolf Hitler's empire as the Allies sought to bring an end to one of history's darkest chapters. The beginning of 1945 saw Germany in a dire position. The Red Army had launched massive offensives on the Eastern Front, driving deep into German-held territory. The Soviet forces, under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and others, were relentless in their pursuit of revenge for the devastation wrought by Germany during the early years of the war. In January, they unleashed the Vistula-Oder offensive, a major operation that swept through Poland, capturing Warsaw and advancing to within striking distance of Berlin. The sheer scale of the Soviet offensive overwhelmed the German defenses, which were already weakened by depleted resources and low morale. On the Western Front, the Allies had successfully repelled Germany's final counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944. By early 1945, they were poised to push into the heart of Germany. American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine River in March, securing key footholds that would allow them to drive deeper into German territory. The capture of strategic locations like Remagen, where Allied forces seized an intact bridge over the Rhine, symbolized the inevitability of Germany's defeat. The Allies advanced rapidly, liberating concentration camps and uncovering the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime along the way. As the Allies closed in on Germany from both sides, Adolf Hitler's grip on reality weakened. Isolated in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, he refused to acknowledge the dire situation his nation faced. Surrounded by a dwindling circle of loyalists, Hitler issued increasingly irrational orders, expecting his troops to defend every inch of territory to the last man. His belief in miraculous turnarounds and secret weapons bordered on delusion, and his refusal to consider negotiations ensured that Germany would be brought to ruin. The German military, meanwhile, was crumbling under the weight of sustained Allied offensives. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German air superiority, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, a lack of trained pilots, and relentless Allied bombing campaigns had rendered it largely ineffective. The Wehrmacht and SS forces, though still capable of inflicting casualties, were stretched too thin to mount an effective defense. Desperate measures, such as the deployment of Hitler Youth and elderly Volkssturm units, underscored the dire state of Germany's defenses. By April 1945, the situation had become untenable for Germany. The Soviets launched their final assault on Berlin, a city already battered by months of air raids and military defeats. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal and chaotic struggle, marked by urban combat, heavy artillery bombardments, and fierce resistance from German forces. Soviet troops encircled the city, cutting off any hope of escape or reinforcement. As the Red Army advanced street by street, they encountered stiff resistance from remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS troops, and even civilians conscripted into the Volkssturm. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler's world was collapsing. Reports of Soviet advances grew grimmer by the hour, and key cities such as Vienna and Munich fell to the Allies. Hitler's inner circle began to fracture as high-ranking officials like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler sought to secure their futures, defying Hitler's orders in the process. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks away from the bunker, Hitler took his own life alongside Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before. Their deaths marked the end of the Nazi leadership and a symbolic conclusion to the Third Reich. The fall of Berlin was a decisive moment in the war. On May 2nd, the city's remaining defenders surrendered to the Soviets, effectively ending organized resistance in the German capital. The German military and government, now leaderless and demoralized, scrambled to negotiate terms of surrender. On May 7th, German representatives signed an unconditional surrender in Reims, France, officially ending the war in Europe. The following day, May 8th, was celebrated as Victory in Europe, VE Day, marking the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. While the surrender brought relief and jubilation to the Allied nations, the aftermath of the war revealed the full extent of the horrors perpetrated by the Nazi regime. Allied troops liberating concentration camps uncovered mass graves, emaciated survivors, and evidence of industrial-scale genocide. The Holocaust had claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims, including political dissidents, Romani people, disabled individuals, and prisoners of war. The liberation of the camps forced the world to confront the atrocities committed under Hitler's rule and underscored the need for justice and accountability. The Allied powers faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered Europe and ensuring that such a catastrophe could never happen again. Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The Nuremberg trials were established to hold Nazi leaders accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. These trials marked the beginning of international efforts to codify laws governing war and human rights. The collapse of Nazi Germany also had profound geopolitical consequences. The alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain, which had held together during the war, began to fracture as ideological differences emerged. The division of Germany into East and West, along with the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe under Soviet influence, set the stage for the Cold War. The scars of World War II, both physical and psychological, would shape the world for decades to come. For the German people, the end of the war brought both relief and devastation. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the economy was in shambles. The process of denazification, aimed at removing Nazi influence from society, forced Germans to reckon with their nation's complicity in the crimes of the regime. Amidst the destruction, the seeds of a new Germany began to take root, one that would eventually rise from the ashes as a peaceful and democratic nation. The final collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 was a moment of triumph and tragedy. It marked the end of a brutal regime that had plunged the world into chaos, but it also left behind a legacy of suffering and loss. The lessons of this dark chapter in history serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, unity, and the defense of human rights. In the years that followed, the world would strive to rebuild and heal, drawing strength from the sacrifices made and the hope for a better future. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 was not merely the result of military campaigns. It was the culmination of years of systemic failure, hubris, and the relentless pressure applied by the Allies. As the events of that fateful year unfolded, the sheer scale of devastation and the human cost of the war became tragically clear. The downfall of the Third Reich was marked by desperate last stands, strategic miscalculations, and the relentless determination of the Allied forces to bring an end to Hitler's reign of terror. The beginning of 1945 saw a shattered Germany, struggling to hold on to its territories in the face of an unstoppable Allied advance. The Eastern Front was a harrowing tableau of destruction and suffering. Soviet forces under Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev were poised to unleash a series of devastating offensives. The Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January, was a masterpiece of coordination and overwhelming force. Within weeks, Soviet troops had pushed German forces back hundreds of miles, capturing key cities like Krakow and Lodz and advancing to the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin. For the people of Germany, the Soviet advance was a nightmare realized. The atrocities committed by German forces during their invasion of the Soviet Union were repaid in kind as the Red Army swept westward. Reports of mass rapes, looting, and indiscriminate violence spread fear among the civilian population. Millions fled their homes, creating a chaotic exodus that further strained Germany's crumbling infrastructure. The Wehrmacht, battered and demoralized, was unable to stem the tide. Soldiers fought bravely in some areas, but their efforts were futile against the sheer size and determination of the Soviet forces. On the Western Front, the Allies were preparing their final push into Germany. Following the failure of the German counteroffensive during the Battle of the Bulge, the American, British, and Canadian armies regained momentum. In March, Allied forces achieved a critical breakthrough when they crossed the Rhine River at Remagen. The unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge provided the Allies with a direct route into the heart of Germany, bypassing many of the natural defenses that had slowed their progress. The Allies moved quickly to capitalize on this advantage. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, coordinated a multi-pronged attack designed to encircle and destroy German forces. American troops under General George S. Patton's Third Army pushed deep into German territory, while British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery advanced from the north. The French army, eager to reclaim its homeland, joined the offensive, liberating cities and villages that had been under Nazi occupation for years. As the Allies advanced, they encountered scenes of unimaginable horror. Concentration camps, once hidden from the world, were liberated one by one. Camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen revealed the extent of the Holocaust. Emaciated survivors, mass graves, and the remnants of industrialized murder laid bare the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were often left in shock by what they witnessed. The liberation of these camps became a rallying cry for justice and underscored the moral imperative of defeating Nazi Germany. Inside Berlin, Adolf Hitler's world was unraveling. The once mighty dictator was now a paranoid, isolated figure, issuing orders from his underground bunker. Hitler's obsession with loyalty and betrayal led to irrational decisions that further weakened Germany's defenses. He placed faith in non-existent divisions, dismissed capable commanders, and prioritized symbolic victories over strategic realities. His refusal to allow tactical withdrawals resulted in unnecessary losses and accelerated Germany's collapse. By April 1945, the Battle of Berlin had begun. The Soviet Union had committed over 2 million troops, thousands of tanks, and massive amounts of artillery to the assault on the German capital. The city, once a symbol of Nazi power, was now a battleground of rubble and ruin. Street-by-street combat ensued as Soviet soldiers faced desperate resistance from German defenders. The defenders included Wehrmacht regulars, SS units, and Volkssturm militias made up of elderly men and young boys. Despite their valiant efforts, the German forces were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The fighting in Berlin was among the fiercest of the war. Soviet artillery pounded the city relentlessly, reducing buildings to rubble and turning entire neighborhoods into wastelands. The civilian population, already suffering from years of bombing raids and shortages, endured unimaginable hardship. Food and water were scarce, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Many civilians sought refuge in basements and subway tunnels, while others attempted to flee the city, only to be caught in the crossfire. Amid this chaos, Hitler's inner circle began to disintegrate. High-ranking officials like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring attempted to negotiate their own surrenders to the Allies, betraying their Führer in his final days. Hitler, enraged by these acts of perceived treason, ordered the arrest of anyone he suspected of disloyalty. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler took his own life, along with Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day. The death of Hitler marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, but the fighting continued. German commanders in Berlin, including General Helmuth Weidling, attempted to negotiate a surrender to the Soviets to spare the remaining civilian population. On May 2, the defenders of Berlin laid down their arms, and the city fell into Soviet hands. The final days of Berlin were a grim epilogue to a war that had brought untold suffering to millions. While Berlin fell, the Western Allies continued their advance across Germany. American forces captured key cities like Munich and Nuremberg, while British and Canadian troops moved into northern Germany. On May 7, 1945, German representatives signed an unconditional surrender in Reims, France. The surrender was ratified the following day in Berlin, officially ending the war in Europe. May 8 became known as Victory in Europe, VE Day, a moment of celebration and relief for the Allied nations. The aftermath of the war was staggering. Germany was a nation in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its population displaced and traumatized. Millions of Germans faced starvation, homelessness, and the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. The Allied occupation divided Germany into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the major Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. This division laid the groundwork for the eventual split of Germany into East and West, a division that would define the Cold War. The Nuremberg trials, held in 1945 and 1946, sought to bring Nazi leaders to justice for their crimes. High-ranking officials such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. The trials established important precedents for international law and accountability, ensuring that the atrocities of the Holocaust and other war crimes would not go unpunished. The collapse of Nazi Germany also reshaped the global order. The United Nations was established in 1945 to promote peace and prevent future conflicts. The United States emerged as a global superpower, its economy bolstered by wartime production and its military unmatched. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the ideological rivalry of the Cold War. For the survivors of the Holocaust and the war's countless other victims, the end of the conflict was bittersweet. Liberation brought freedom, but it also revealed the full extent of the horrors that had been endured. Efforts to rebuild and recover were monumental, requiring international cooperation and decades of perseverance. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 was a turning point in history, a moment of both triumph and tragedy. It marked the end of one of the darkest periods the world had ever known and the beginning of a new era. The lessons of that year, of the dangers of unchecked power, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of unity in the face of tyranny, continue to resonate today. As the world moved forward, the sacrifices made in 1945 served as a reminder of the cost of freedom and the enduring value of justice.